Emma had always thought her life was perfect. She lived in a small, cozy house with her parents, Margaret and Harold. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with trees that swayed gently in the breeze and friendly neighbors who waved hello whenever they passed by. Her home wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was warm, inviting, and full of love, or so she believed. Margaret was kind and patient, always ready with a hug or a plate of freshly baked cookies. Harold, on the other hand, was funny and easygoing. He loved telling silly jokes that made Emma laugh until her stomach hurt. Together, they created a world where Emma felt safe and cherished. They celebrated her birthdays with colorful decorations, cheered loudly at her school plays, and encouraged her dreams of becoming an artist. Every time Emma drew a picture or painted something new, they proudly displayed it on the fridge, calling her their little Picasso. But even in this seemingly perfect life, there were moments that stood out, tiny cracks in the foundation of their happy family. Sometimes when Emma asked questions about her childhood, like why she looked so different from her parents or how old she was when they adopted her, they mentioned adoption once long ago, Margaret and Harold would exchange nervous glances. Their smiles became strained, and they quickly changed the subject. "Let's talk about your science project instead," Margaret might say brightly, steering the conversation away. Or Harold would jump in with one of his jokes, making everyone laugh, but not before Emma caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. These little moments stuck with Emma, though she tried not to dwell on them. After all, she reminded herself, every family has its quirks. Maybe it was normal for parents to get uncomfortable when their kids asked too many questions. Still, deep down, she couldn't help but wonder if something was missing, a piece of the puzzle she hadn't been shown yet. One thing Emma absolutely adored was their annual summer vacations. Every year without fail, the family packed up their car and drove to a quaint seaside town. According to Harold, this was where he had proposed to Margaret decades earlier. The town held special memories for them, and Emma loved hearing the story over and over again. They stayed in the same beach house each visit, a charming little cottage with creaky wooden floors and a porch overlooking the ocean. For Emma, it was magical, a place where time seemed to slow down and everything felt peaceful. This particular summer, however, things felt off. Margaret spent hours sitting by the window, staring out at the waves as if lost in thought. Harold, usually cheerful and relaxed, snapped at minor inconveniences like when the Wi-Fi went out or the grocery store ran out of his favorite cereal. Emma noticed these changes but didn't say anything. Instead, she busied herself with sketching seashells and watching sunsets, trying to enjoy their vacation, despite the strange atmosphere. One evening after dinner, Emma decided to relax in the living room while Margaret washed dishes and Harold took a walk along the shore. Flipping through channels on the old TV, she stumbled upon a news segment playing softly in the background. At first, she paid little attention, just another rerun of some forgotten report. But then, something caught her eye, a grainy photograph of a young girl flashing across the screen. The resemblance was uncanny. The girl in the photo had dark hair, big eyes, and a shy smile that looked eerily familiar. As the reporter spoke about a missing child case from 20 years ago, Emma leaned closer, her heart pounding. Who was this girl? And why did she feel like she already knew her? Before she could process what she was seeing, Margaret walked into the room. One glance at the TV and her face turned ghostly pale. Without a word, she rushed forward and switched it off, leaving the room silent except for the sound of Emma's racing thoughts. The room fell silent after Margaret turned off the TV, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with the remote. Emma stared at her mother, her mind racing with questions. Why had Margaret reacted so strongly? What was it about that old news report that seemed to unsettle her so deeply? For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound came from the rhythmic crashing of waves against the shore outside. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "Mom, what was that?" she asked cautiously, trying to keep her voice steady. "That girl on the news. She looked like me." Margaret hesitated, her lips pressed tightly together as if weighing her words carefully. When she finally spoke, her tone was clipped and dismissive. "It's nothing, Emma. Just some old story from years ago. You shouldn't pay attention to things like that. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Instead, there was a flicker of something else. Guilt, maybe, or fear, that Emma couldn't quite place. But Emma wasn't satisfied. Something about the way Margaret had reacted gnawed at her. It wasn't just the suddenness of turning off the TV. It was the way her mother avoided meeting her gaze, the way her hands trembled even now as she set the remote down on the coffee table. This wasn't normal behavior. If it really was nothing, why did Margaret seem so rattled? Determined to get answers, Emma decided to press further. "Mom, I'm not a kid anymore," she said gently but firmly. "You can tell me if something's wrong. That girl, she looked exactly like me. How is that possible?" Margaret sighed heavily, sinking into the armchair across from Emma. For a moment she looked older than Emma had ever seen her, as if the weight of years she'd never spoken about suddenly bore down on her shoulders. "Emma, please," she pleaded softly. "Let's not talk about this right now. It's late and we're all tired. We'll discuss it tomorrow, okay?" But Emma knew better. Tomorrow would come, and Margaret would find another excuse to change the subject. She could see it in her mother's face, the same evasive expression she'd worn countless times before whenever certain topics arose. Whatever secret lay behind that news report, Margaret clearly didn't want to share it. And that made Emma more curious and more suspicious than ever. Later that night, lying awake in bed, Emma replayed the scene over and over in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of the girl from the news, the dark hair, the big eyes, the faint resemblance to herself. Who was she? Why had her disappearance been reported 20 years ago? And most importantly, why had Margaret reacted the way she did? Unable to sleep, Emma slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the living room. The beach house was quiet, the only sounds coming from the creaking floorboards beneath her feet and the distant hum of crickets outside. She grabbed the TV remote and turned it back on, scrolling through channels until she found the local news station again. To her disappointment, the segment about the missing girl was no longer airing. Frustrated but undeterred, Emma decided to take matters into her own hands. The next morning, while Margaret and Harold were busy unpacking groceries, Emma snuck away to a nearby cafe with free Wi-Fi. Sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee, she opened her laptop and began searching online for clues. She typed keywords like missing girl and seaside town into the search bar, scrolling through pages of results until one headline caught her eye. Mystery surrounds disappearance of 5-year-old Lila Carter. Clicking on the article, Emma felt her stomach drop. There it was, the same grainy photo she'd seen on TV the night before. Beneath it was a brief description of the case. Lila Carter had vanished without a trace 2 decades earlier under mysterious circumstances. Authorities suspected foul play but had no concrete leads. The case remained unsolved. As Emma read through the details, her heart began to race. According to the article, Lila had disappeared shortly after being spotted playing in a park near her home. Witnesses claimed they saw a man and woman arguing nearby, but no arrests were ever made. The more Emma read, the more unsettling parallels she noticed between Lila's story and her own life. Could it be a coincidence? Or was there something deeper? Something her parents had been hiding all along? By the time she returned to the beach house, Emma's mind was spinning with possibilities. She wanted to confront Margaret and Harold immediately, but she also knew she needed proof. This wasn't just idle curiosity anymore. It was a quest for answers. Little did she know, those answers would lead her down a path far more complicated and emotional than she could have imagined. Back at the beach house, Emma tried to act normal, but her mind was racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the article she'd read and the eerie resemblance between herself and Lila Carter. Every glance at Margaret or Harold made her wonder what they were hiding. How could they have kept such a secret from her for so long? The thought gnawed at her, making it hard to focus on anything else. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emma decided to dig deeper. While Margaret and Harold sat outside on the porch, sipping tea and chatting quietly, she slipped into the living room with her laptop. The Wi-Fi signal was weak, but it was enough for her to continue her search. She typed, "Lila Carter missing," case into the search bar again, this time adding keywords like updates and recent developments. As she scrolled through the results, one particular detail caught her attention. Lila had disappeared exactly 20 years ago. That would make her around 25 now, the same age Emma was. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it really be possible? Was she Lila Carter? The idea seemed absurd, yet the evidence was piling up in a way that was impossible to ignore. Emma clicked on another link, which led her to an old police report. It mentioned that Lila's biological parents, Sarah and Daniel Carter, had been questioned during the investigation, but were never charged due to lack of evidence. However, rumors swirled that they might have been involved in illegal activities. The report also included descriptions of Lila: dark hair, brown eyes, a small birthmark behind her left ear. Emma's hand instinctively went to her own ear. She'd always had a tiny mark there, something she'd never thought twice about until now. Her hands trembled as she printed out the articles she found, stacking them neatly on the desk. She didn't know why she felt compelled to gather physical copies. It was as if having them in her hands made the truth feel more real. But the more she uncovered, the heavier the weight on her chest became. What if her entire life had been built on a lie? What if Margaret and Harold weren't her real parents after all? The next day, Emma decided she needed answers and she wasn't going to wait any longer. Sitting her parents down in the living room, she laid out the printouts in front of them. "I need you to explain this," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside her. "Who am I? Am I Lila Carter?" Margaret's face turned pale, and Harold looked like he'd just been struck by lightning. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Harold cleared his throat, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by an unfamiliar seriousness. "Emma," he began hesitantly, "we wanted to tell you someday, but we didn't know how." "Tell me what?" Emma demanded, her patience wearing thin. "Is this true? Did you find me when I was little? Are you even my real parents?" Margaret reached out to take Emma's hand, but Emma pulled away. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she struggled to speak. "We found you," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were alone in a park crying. We thought someone had abandoned you. We didn't know what else to do, so we took you in. We changed your name, gave you a new life. We loved you, Emma, we still do." Emma stared at them, her mind reeling. Everything she'd ever known, her identity, her family, her past, felt like it was crumbling around her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice cracking. "How could you keep this from me?" Harold sighed deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. "We were scared," he admitted. "Scared of losing you. Scared of what you might think of us. We convinced ourselves we were doing the right thing, giving you a better life. But now I see how wrong we were." Emma didn't know what to say. A part of her wanted to scream, to demand more answers, to accuse them of lying to her for years. But another part of her, the part that remembered all the love and care they'd given her, couldn't bring herself to lash out. Instead, she stood up and walked out of the room, needing space to process everything. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly before her, its waves crashing against the shore as if trying to wash away the confusion in her mind. She realized this vacation, a trip meant to bring her closer to her family, had instead opened a door to a past she never knew existed, and now she had no choice but to walk through it. The days that followed were a blur for Emma. She spent most of her time alone, either pacing the beach or sitting on the porch with her thoughts tangled in a web of emotions. Anger, confusion, sadness, they all swirled inside her like an unrelenting storm. Margaret and Harold gave her space, but their guilt was palpable. They moved quietly around the house, exchanging worried glances whenever Emma walked by. The carefree atmosphere of their vacation had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence that hung over everything. One morning, as Emma sat staring at the waves, Harold approached her cautiously. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure she was ready to hear more. Harold sat down beside her, his hands clasped tightly together. For a moment, he just looked out at the ocean, gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, weighed down by years of secrets. "We didn't take you lightly," he began. "That day, when we found you in the park, you were so small, so scared. You clung to us like you didn't want to let go. We thought maybe your parents would come back for you, but no one ever did. Days turned into weeks and then months. We kept waiting for someone to claim you, but nothing happened." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "We went through the proper channels. At least we tried. But the system was slow and there were complications. By the time we realized what was happening, it felt too late to turn back. So we made a choice, a selfish one. We decided to keep you, to raise you as our own. We changed your name, filed the paperwork, and built a life for all of us. It wasn't easy, but we loved you from the start, Emma. That part has always been true." Tears streamed down his face now, unchecked and raw. Emma watched him, her heart torn between anger and pity. She wanted to believe him, to forgive him. But the betrayal still stung. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked again, her voice soft but firm. "You could have told me when I was older. You didn't have to lie." Harold shook his head, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his regret. "We were afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you'd hate us, afraid you'd leave. We convinced ourselves it was better this way, that you deserved a fresh start, free from whatever pain might have brought you to that park. But now I see how wrong we were. Keeping this from you only made things worse." Margaret joined them a few minutes later, her eyes red from crying. She knelt beside Emma, taking her hand gently. "Please know that we never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "Every decision we made because we loved you. Even if it was misguided, even if it was wrong, our hearts were in the right place." Emma didn't respond immediately. She needed time to process everything they'd said, to sort through the jumble of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Part of her wanted to lash out, to scream at them for lying to her for so long. But another part, the part that remembered all the love and laughter they'd shared, couldn't deny the truth in their words. They had raised her, cared for her, supported her dreams. Whatever mistakes they'd made, they hadn't done it out of malice. Later that night, Emma lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed every conversation, every confession, every tear-filled apology. She knew she couldn't erase the past, but she also knew she couldn't move forward without answers. If she really was Lila Carter, then somewhere out there was a piece of her history waiting to be uncovered, and she was determined to find it. The next day, Emma decided to hire a private investigator. Using some savings she'd set aside for emergencies, she contacted a reputable agency recommended by a friend. Over the phone, she explained her situation as calmly as she could, sending them copies of the articles and documents she'd gathered. The investigator promised to look into the case and get back to her within a week. As she hung up the phone, Emma felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because she was finally taking steps toward uncovering the truth. Dread because she had no idea what that truth might reveal, or how it would change her life forever. The days leading up to the private investigator's report felt like an eternity for Emma. She alternated between moments of hope and paralyzing anxiety, unsure whether she was ready for the answers that awaited her. Margaret and Harold tried to reach out to her during this time, offering quiet support or leaving small gestures. A cup of tea on her bedside table, a note saying, "We're here if you need us." But Emma kept her distance, needing space to process everything. Finally, the call came. The private investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Carter, ironically sharing a surname with Emma's suspected biological family, asked to meet in person to discuss her findings. Emma agreed, choosing a quiet cafe in town where she could focus without distractions. As she sat waiting, her fingers nervously tapped against the edge of the table. When Ms. Carter arrived carrying a slim folder, Emma's heart raced. "Thank you for coming," Emma said, trying to sound calm despite the storm inside her. Ms. Carter nodded, setting the folder down carefully. "You've been through a lot already, so I'll get straight to the point," she began. "Based on the evidence you provided and additional research, we were able to confirm something significant. Your DNA matches records linked to Lila Carter." Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. Though she'd suspected it all along, hearing it confirmed aloud hit her like a tidal wave. She was Lila Carter, the missing girl from the news report. Her life as she knew it had been built on someone else's tragedy, someone else's secrets. Ms. Carter continued, explaining how investigators originally believed Lila's disappearance was connected to her parents' involvement in illegal activities. According to old police reports, Sarah and Daniel Carter weren't ordinary people. They were part of a criminal network involved in smuggling operations. Their sudden vanishing shortly after Lila went missing suggested they may have fled to avoid arrest, leaving their daughter behind in panic. But why would they leave her? Emma interrupted, her voice trembling. How could anyone abandon their own child? Ms. Carter hesitated before answering. From what we can piece together, it seems they were desperate. Maybe they thought they couldn't care for you anymore. Or maybe... She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Perhaps Lila had simply been an inconvenience during their escape. Emma's mind reeled at the thought. Whatever her biological parents' reasons, their actions, or lack thereof, had shattered her early childhood. And yet, those same circumstances had led her to Margaret and Harold, who had stepped in when no one else did. It was a strange, painful irony. Before leaving, Ms. Carter handed Emma a copy of the case file, including updated information about Sarah and Daniel Carter. Authorities had recently flagged them abroad, living under assumed names. They hadn't been arrested yet, but were under surveillance. If Emma wanted closure, she could try reaching out to them, but Ms. Carter warned her to prepare for disappointment. People like Sarah and Daniel rarely changed, even after years on the run. That night, Emma sat alone in her room, staring at the documents spread across her bed. The facts were undeniable, but they didn't bring clarity. Instead, they raised more questions. Who were these people? Were they monsters, criminals, or just flawed humans making terrible choices? Did they ever think about her? Did they regret leaving her behind? As she sifted through the papers, Emma realized something important. Knowing the truth wouldn't automatically heal her wounds. Finding her biological parents wouldn't magically fill the void left by years of unanswered questions. But understanding her past might help her reclaim a sense of control over her future. For the first time since discovering the news report, Emma allowed herself to cry. Not out of anger or sadness, but out of relief. She finally had answers, even if they weren't the ones she'd hoped for. And though the road ahead promised challenges, Emma knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone. Whether it was Margaret and Harold, Ms. Carter, or the fragments of her own resilience, she had support. Now it was up to her to decide what came next, and how much of her story she wanted to rewrite. With the case file in hand and a clearer picture of her past, Emma felt like she was standing at a crossroads. She had two paths ahead of her. One led to Sarah and Daniel Carter, the biological parents who had abandoned her. The other circled back to Margaret and Harold, the people who had raised her as their own, despite their mistakes. Both paths came with uncertainty, but Emma knew she couldn't move forward without confronting them both. Her first step was reaching out to Detective Monroe, the officer who had worked on Lila Carter's case 20 years ago. Though now retired, he agreed to meet her at a small diner near his home. When Emma arrived, she found him sitting in a corner booth, sipping coffee and thumbing through an old notebook filled with faded handwriting. He looked up as she approached, offering a warm but weary smile. "You've got guts," he said after introducing himself. "Not many people have the courage to dig this deep into their past." Emma nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. "I just want to understand what happened," she admitted. "Who were they? Why did they leave me?" Detective Monroe sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Sarah and Daniel Carter weren't good people, Emma. They were involved in some dangerous stuff. Smuggling, forgery, you name it. Back then, we thought their disappearance was tied to a major police raid targeting their operation. We assumed they fled because they didn't want to face charges. But why leave me behind? Emma pressed, her voice trembling slightly. Why abandon a child? The detective hesitated, choosing his words carefully. From what we gathered, they weren't exactly nurturing parents. Neighbors reported hearing arguments late at night, seeing bruises on your arms when you played outside. It's possible they saw you as a liability during their escape, or maybe they just didn't care enough to take you with them. Emma's chest tightened at the thought. The idea of being unwanted by her own blood parents cut deeper than she expected. But Detective Monroe wasn't finished. That doesn't mean you deserved what happened, he added firmly. No kid deserves that. What matters is how far you've come since then. And that says a lot about the people who stepped in to raise you. His words lingered in Emma's mind long after their meeting ended. She returned to the beach house feeling conflicted. Part of her wanted to track down Sarah and Daniel, to confront them and demand answers. Another part recoiled at the idea of reconnecting with people who might not even deserve forgiveness. Either way, she knew she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Margaret and Harold noticed the change in her demeanor immediately. They sat her down one evening, their expressions a mix of concern and guilt. We don't expect you to forgive us right away, Margaret began softly. But please know we're here for you no matter what you decide. Harold nodded in agreement. If you need space, we'll give it to you. If you want to find them, we'll support that too. Their sincerity touched Emma deeply. Despite everything, they still loved her unconditionally. That realization softened some of the anger she'd been carrying. While she still struggled to fully reconcile their deception, she understood now that their intentions had always stemmed from love, even if misguided. By the end of the week, Emma made her decision. She reached out to authorities monitoring Sarah and Daniel Carter abroad, asking for permission to contact them. To her surprise, they agreed, arranging a supervised video call. As the day of the call approached, Emma wrestled with nerves and doubt. What would she say? Would they even recognize her? Or worse, would they act like strangers? On the morning of the call, Emma sat in front of her laptop, her heart pounding. When the screen flickered to life, revealing the faces of Sarah and Daniel Carter, she felt a strange mixture of shock and numbness. They looked older, worn down by years of running, but there was no mistaking the resemblance. The same dark hair, the same sharp features mirrored faintly in her own reflection. For several minutes, neither side spoke. Then Sarah broke the silence, her voice cracking. Lila, is that really you? Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to respond. My name is Emma now, she said evenly, and I just want to know why. Why did you leave me? Daniel shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. Sarah, however, stared directly at the camera, tears streaming down her face. We didn't have a choice, she whispered. We thought we were protecting you. But Emma could see the truth, or lack thereof, in their eyes. Their excuses rang hollow, their regret too little, too late. As the call ended, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She didn't need closure from them. She already had everything she needed back home, with Margaret and Harold, the people who had truly been her family all along. The video call with Sarah and Daniel left Emma drained but strangely relieved. For years, she had carried the weight of unanswered questions about her past, wondering if her biological parents were victims of circumstance or simply absent figures in her life. Now, seeing them face to face, or rather screen to screen, she realized they were neither heroes nor redeemable characters. They were flawed, broken people who had made selfish choices, and while their explanations might have been intended to justify their actions, Emma knew deep down that their words wouldn't change anything. That night, as waves crashed against the shore outside the beach house, Emma sat on the porch with Margaret and Harold. The air was cool, carrying the salty scent of the ocean. She hadn't planned to talk to them yet. She needed time to process everything. But when Margaret gently placed a hand on her shoulder and asked how she was feeling, Emma found herself opening up. They're not who I thought they'd be. She admitted, her voice soft but steady. I guess part of me hoped they'd apologize, explain everything, and somehow make it right. But they didn't. They're still running from their problems just like they did 20 years ago. Harold nodded slowly, his expression pained, but understanding. We can't change the past, Emma, he said quietly. All we can do is decide how we move forward. Emma looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time in days. Despite everything, the lies, the secrets, the years of hiding the truth, they were still the same people who had raised her. They were still the ones who had cheered at her school plays, comforted her after heartbreaks, and celebrated her successes as if they were their own. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that mattered more than anything else. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you, Emma said finally, her eyes glistening with tears. But I do know this. You're my parents. Not because of biology, but because of everything you've done for me. You gave me a home, a family, a life. And even though you made mistakes, I can't ignore that. Margaret's breath hitched and she pulled Emma into a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. Harold joined in, wrapping his arms around both of them. It was a moment of raw vulnerability, one that reminded Emma of all the quiet, unspoken bonds that tied them together. Forgiveness wasn't easy. It would take time. But she could feel the first steps toward healing beginning to form. Over the next few days, Emma focused on rebuilding her relationship with Margaret and Harold. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, and laughing over old memories. There were moments of tension, of course, when old wounds resurfaced, but they faced them together, determined to move forward. Slowly but surely, the cracks in their family began to mend. One afternoon, while sketching seashells on the beach, Emma found herself thinking about her art. For years, she had used painting and drawing as an escape, a way to express emotions she couldn't put into words. Now, inspired by everything she'd been through, she decided to channel those feelings into something bigger. She envisioned a series of pieces exploring themes of identity, loss, and redemption. Each canvas would tell a chapter of her story, from the little girl abandoned in a park to the woman finding strength in her scars. When she shared the idea with Margaret and Harley, they immediately encouraged her. This is your journey, Margaret said proudly, and if anyone can turn pain into beauty, it's you. By the end of their vacation, Emma felt lighter, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She no longer felt defined by the secrets of her past or the fears of her future. Instead, she embraced the complexity of her story, the good, the bad, and everything in between. On the drive home, as the seaside town faded into the distance, Emma glanced at Margaret and Harold sitting beside her. Though their road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, she knew they would face it together, as a family. And for the first time in weeks, she felt at peace. Months passed, and Emma threw herself into her art with a renewed sense of purpose. The series she had envisioned during their vacation became her most personal project yet. Each painting was a vivid reflection of her journey, some filled with dark, swirling colors that captured the confusion and pain of uncovering her past, while others glowed with warmth and light, symbolizing hope, forgiveness, and resilience. She poured every ounce of emotion into her work, determined to turn her struggles into something meaningful. When the pieces were finally complete, Emma decided to host her first solo gallery exhibition, titled Fragments of Me. The collection told her story in brushstrokes and hues. From the portrait of a young girl sitting alone in a park to abstract depictions of fractured identities coming together, each artwork carried a piece of her soul. Margaret and Harold helped her prepare for the big night, assisting with invitations, setting up displays, and offering endless encouragement. The evening of the exhibition arrived, and the gallery buzzed with excitement. Friends, family, and even strangers wandered through the space, stopping to admire Emma's creations. Many visitors lingered by certain paintings, clearly moved by the raw emotion behind them. Some whispered among themselves about how powerful the message felt, while others simply stood in silence, absorbing the depth of her story. As Emma greeted guests, she noticed Margaret and Harold standing near the centerpiece of the exhibit, a large canvas titled Home. It depicted two figures walking hand in hand with a younger girl between them, surrounded by soft golden light. The figures weren't perfect, their outlines blurred and fragmented, representing flaws and imperfections, yet they radiated love and connection, anchoring the entire composition. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, overcome with emotion. "This is us," she said softly to Harold, gesturing toward the painting. "It's not perfect, but it's ours." Harold nodded, his voice thick with pride. "And it's beautiful." When it came time for Emma to speak, she stepped onto a small platform at the center of the room, her heart pounding. Looking out at the crowd, she saw familiar faces, her parents, friends, teachers who had believed in her over the years, and many unfamiliar ones too. Taking a deep breath, she began to share her story. "This collection is about finding yourself when nothing feels certain," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "It's about confronting painful truths, forgiving those who hurt you, and learning to embrace the beauty in brokenness. These paintings are my way of saying thank you to everyone here for supporting me through this journey, and especially to my parents, Margaret and Harold, who reminded me that family isn't always about bloodlines. Sometimes it's about choosing each other again and again." The room erupted in applause, and Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. As she stepped down from the platform, Margaret and Harold rushed to hug her tightly. For the first time, in what felt like forever, she truly felt whole, not because everything was fixed, but because she had embraced the messiness of life and found strength within it. In the weeks that followed, Emma continued to create, using her art as a bridge between her past and future. Her exhibition gained attention, earning praise from critics and opening doors to new opportunities. But more importantly, it allowed her to connect with others who had faced similar struggles, reminding her that she wasn't alone. Though questions about Sarah and Daniel Carter still lingered in the back of her mind, Emma no longer let them define her. They were part of her history, yes, but they didn't dictate her present or future. Instead, she chose to focus on the people who mattered most, the ones who had stood by her through thick and thin. One evening, as Emma sat on the porch of her childhood home sketching under the fading sunlight, Harold joined her with 2 cups of tea. "You've come so far, kiddo," he said, handing her one of the steaming mugs. Emma smiled, leaning back in her chair. "We all have," she replied, "and we're not done yet." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Emma felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life was unpredictable, messy, and often painful, but it was also full of moments worth cherishing. And in that moment, surrounded by love and possibility, she knew she was exactly where she belonged.